It's a dog-eat-dog world out there, and sometimes it's a rabbit-eating grass world, or even a bird-eating fish world. Or sometimes, on very rare occasions, you might find a pelican trying to eat a pigeon world. I don't know what it is, but watching a pelican trying to eat a pigeonhole, absolutely vile. Grimmest thing I've ever seen. Carrying on. Today we're going to be looking at food chains, food webs, and everything in between, all as a part of our ecosystems playlist that we're covering here on Mr. Thomas the Teacher. So, with that being said, would you like to, I don't know, sit down, get ready, crack on with today's video? Off we go. So, before we even get into food chains and food webs and all that good stuff, we're going to have to cover some of the basics. And the basics being the fact that you can classify different species by the foods that they eat. So, for example, we could classify this rabbit as a herbivore, meaning that it eats plants as its primary source of food. So, the rabbit here eats plants, grasses, berries, nuts, whatever it can find, as long as it's plant matter to keep itself alive. So, it's a herbivore. Secondly, we could talk about, no, oh God, no, not again, not the pigeon. What is it with the pigeon? Change it, better example. The wolf, good, much better example. The wolf is a great example of what we call a carnivore, a species that only eats other animals or eats meat as its primary source of food. I hate that pelican clip so much. Then lastly, we have omnivores or omnivorous species, which means that they like to dabble in a little bit of everything. They like to eat a little bit of meat, they like to eat a little bit of plants. So things like us, we are omnivores. We eat plants, we eat meat. Lovely. Rats do the same. They eat plants, they eat meat. Anything that eats a little bit of both, we could describe as omnivorous or as an omnivore. So that's the basics covered. Let's get on to food chains. A food chain, quite simply, shows us how living organisms get their food. Within a food chain, you can see that living organisms eat one another, and as they eat each other, nutrients and energy is passed on up through the food chain. So behind me, you'll notice that I have a food chain. It's based off something that you might find in a small-scale ecosystem, such as a pond or a lake here in the UK. We start down at the bottom of our food chain with the producer, the algae, so it gets its energy from the sun through photosynthesis, and that gets consumed by the primary consumer, the aquatic worms. Then our little aquatic worms, they get nommed on by the secondary consumer, the dragonfly, and then the dragonfly gets consumed by the big bad fish of the pond, our tertiary consumer. And lastly, at the very top of our food chain is the heron. It's our quaternary consumer. And also, you'll notice that there's nothing else above the heron, making it the apex predator of our particular ecosystem. Remember, as we move through the food chain, the total population size of the species will decrease. So, for example, there will be a lot more aquatic worms in that particular ecosystem than there would be heron. In the standard kind of small-scale British pond, you may only have 2 or 3 heron at any one point, and then you could have potentially hundreds of thousands of aquatic worms. So food webs are the bigger, better, smarter version of a food chain. Not only do they show us the kind of direction that energy moves in as it flows through an ecosystem, but it also shows all the species in a particular ecosystem, and it displays a lot more interconnectedness between the biotic components. If you don't know what that is, go check out my last video on ecosystems. It's the same ecosystem, it's the pond, but you'll notice there's a lot more species behind me than there was before. We can see that there's a lot more species now. We've got 2 producers, 4 primary consumers, 4 secondary consumers, still 1 tertiary consumer, poor little fishies by himself, but then there's 2 quaternary consumers. So you can see that there's a lot more species interconnected with one another than just displayed in the food chain. You'll also notice on the side of the food chain we have decomposers. So there'll be things like worms, fungi, bacteria, things that break down dead organic matter. Their role in the ecosystem is to literally break down that matter and return nutrients into the soil or the substrate or whatever it is that kind of acts as the sediment. So in the pond, it's probably substrate. When a question gets asked about changing the size of a population within a food chain or food web, there's 2 things you need to consider. Firstly, think about the prey of the species. If you have more predators, you will have less prey because, more of them get eaten. But if you have less predators, you'll have more prey because less of them get eaten. Secondly, think about the predators of that particular species. If I have more prey, then I'll have more predators because there's more food for them. Lovely. If I have less prey, then I'll have less predators because there's less food. They starve to death. And so that's it then. The concept of food chains, food webs, and everything in between. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. In the description below, you'll find today's worksheet. And as always, it's time to pack up, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Adios. It's a dog-eat-dog world out there. Sometimes it's a rabbit-eat-grass world, or a... No. So, for example, we could classify this rabbit as a herbivore. So herbivores are species that only eat or primarily eat plants as their main source of kind of energy or the main source of food. So, for example, the rabbit, it just eats grasses, plants and berries. That's its primary food sources, making it a herbivore. I'm waffling. I'm repeating the same thing over and over again. The wolf, a much better example than the carnivorous pigeon. I got it wrong! So that's the basics covered. Let's get on to food chains then. So food chains are very simply a chain of organisms eating one another. No, I was too disconnected. I didn't like it. Didn't vibe with it. You must get the vibe with geography. We know this now. It's the very same ecosystem as before, but now, still wrong. We can see that now we don't just have one producer, we have two. I shouldn't do my hand gesture like that. That was an accent. I'm very sorry.